Stanford University.
All right, hello everybody. So I've been asked to speak a bit about this earlier period of the so-called culture wars, a term that I believe was coined in this first iteration of this sort of thing. And so I will do that and then give some brief thoughts on the current situation. So as it is playing out in this round, the first iteration of culture wars in 89 to 92 revolved around issues of government funding for the arts, and that was sort of the lightning rod for all sorts of things, opinions about aesthetics, religion, sexuality, and the role of government and the state of society, and so on. In this first period, 89 to 92, the focus was the National Endowment for the Arts, a federal agency that existed to support arts in the United States. Founded in 1965 by President Lyndon Johnson, who said when he signed the legislation, "We fully recognize that no government can call artistic excellence into existence, nor should any government seek to restrict the freedom of the artist to pursue his own goals in his own way." So the spirit of the NEA from the outset was one of openness and sort of measured optimism about what the results might be. That was 1965. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan came into office, he attempted to abolish the National Endowment for the Arts, but at that time there was insufficient support from Congress, and he was unable to either abolish or defund the agency. So that was in 1980. In a way, the opening salvo of what later became the culture wars about 8 or 10 years later. I arrived as a young curator at the Berkeley Art Museum in the fall of 1988, and I was probably 26 years old, something like that at that time, 27. It was my first curatorial job. I had not held a curatorial position before, and within weeks of arriving, the director called me into his office and said, "I'd like you to look at this exhibition and tell me if you think it's something we ought to do." And it was the Robert Mapplethorpe Perfect Moment show that was being proposed to the museum. And I took it, I looked at it, and I said to him, "No, I don't think we should do it. I don't think it's high enough quality. The work is formal. It doesn't have a point of view. It's not. I don't think we should do it." And he said, "Okay, fine." I went back to my office, and there was the thing on my desk with a note that said, "Here's your first project. Good luck." So that was my first project. So that was the fall of 1988. In December of that year, December 9th, 1988, the show opened at the ICA in Philadelphia, and in March, about 4 months later, Robert Mapplethorpe died of AIDS. 1989, March 9th, 1989, age of 42. In April of that year, so just a month later, conservative Republicans discovered that the National Endowment for the Arts had funded $15,000 to the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art to a group installation that included Andres Serrano's Piss Christ. I'm sure you know this is a piece with the crucifix in the urine, a photograph of that. And you can't really tell that it's urine from the photograph. It's just like a beautiful yellow atmosphere. But that's what it was. So the Republicans, in May of 1989, the Republicans led by Jesse Helms, a very conservative senator from North Carolina, denounced on the Senate floor any grant of the NEA that was not censored according to national arts policy against elitist, blasphemous statements, sex, and violence. At the same time, there was a student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, a fellow named Dred Scott Tyler, who became the subject of extraordinary controversy. This was right around the same time, for his piece, "What is the proper way to display an American flag?" Which included an American flag that people were invited to come and walk on. The United States Senate voted on March 17th, so all of this is happening in a very compressed period. We have not progressed more than 4 months since my own arrival at the Berkeley Art Museum. It is now, the US Senate is debating this. They vote 97-0 to make it a federal crime to display an American flag on the floor or the ground. Veterans marched on the museum, there were bomb threats, and the governor of Illinois revoked all funding to the school and the Illinois Arts Alliance, which had supported the project. On June of that year, 2 months later, the Corcoran Art Gallery in Washington announced that it was canceling the Mapplethorpe show, the very same Mapplethorpe show. They had been scheduled to be on the tour. They canceled the show because they didn't want to, quote, adversely affect the NEA's congressional appropriation. The NEA was up for refunding, and they didn't want to jeopardize that. The Corcoran was picketed, and slides of the photographs were projected on the exterior of the building. And the show was taken up almost instantaneously by a very small artist-run organization called Washington Project for the Arts, very close to the Capitol building, and the show happened there instead of at Corcoran. In July of that year, Senator Jesse Helms introduced an amendment, subsequently known as the Helms Amendment, that banned grants from being used to, quote, promote, disseminate, or produce obscene or indecent materials, including but not limited to depictions of sadomasochism, homoeroticism, the exploitation of children, or individuals engaged in sex acts, so on. Also banned was art which denigrates or debases or reviles a person, group, or class of citizens on the basis of race, creed, sex, handicap, age, or national origin. The Senate passed this Helms Amendment on a voice vote with only 5 senators present. I don't know how that happened. In early October 1989, so now we're in the fall of '89, Congress reached a compromise on the NEA's 1990 appropriations bill, which rejected the Helms Amendment, but still left in restrictions on content. So the appropriation that was approved prohibited funding for projects that promote, disseminate, or produce materials which in the judgment of the National Endowment for the Arts or the National Endowment for Humanities may be considered obscene, including but not limited to depictions of sadomasochism, homoeroticism, sexual exploitation of children, or individuals engaged in sex acts, and which, taken as a whole, do not have serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So that the amount that was appropriated for the NEA was $171 million, which was $22 million less than what the Pentagon spent annually on military bans, and amounted to $1.08 per taxpayer per year. In late 1989, the NEA chair, John Frohnmeyer, withdrew a $10,000 grant from an art exhibition, Witnesses Against Our Vanishing, because David Wojnarowicz had written a catalog essay that Frohnmeyer felt was too political. Frohnmeyer also denied in that round, so we're now in late '89, grants that had been recommended by the panelists of the NEA. So the NEA process, you go through a panel, the panelists recommended grants, the chairman vetoed them to Karen Finley, John Fleck, Holly Hughes, and Tim Miller, who became known as the NEA Four. You may have noticed there is no crucifix in the 13-minute version. There are no male genitals in the first version. In the 13-minute version, but there are in the 7-minute excerpt. Neither of these, as was mentioned before, are what was censored from the National Portrait Gallery. What was censored from the National Portrait Gallery was a 4-minute edited version of the second, of the 7-minute, who knows what it is, and that, the originals had no sound, so sound was added by the curators, sound from an ACT UP demonstration. And I don't know where that sound was obtained, but it was added. So why is this piece shorter, and why does it look the way it does? Well, I'm not sure exactly. I have not spoken to Jonathan, but I think that one of the reasons why the piece was edited was that the people at the museum felt that apparently they had done a survey that proved that museum audiences will not watch a moving image more than 37 seconds. And so there was a compelling need to shorten even this 7-minute piece. So it was shortened to 4 minutes. Apparently, also, in the 7-minute piece, you saw there was graphic masturbation. It was felt that this was not suitable for the show. So this was eliminated, not by David Wojnarowicz. So, I just want to, let's see, commercialize, and I probably should just stop right there. And maybe I can take follow-up questions in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Before I present some images, maybe I should describe my most recent experience and basically why I'm here. In my work, I deal with all kinds of cultural conflicts that in many cases I have lived through in my own personal life, just moving from one country to another, growing up in Mexico, working as an economist there, and then moving here, living in Europe a couple of times. Had created an experience in my personal experience that is expressed in my work. Most of the time when I do my work, I just express my own anxieties about our contemporary world, or my own fears, and whatever crosses my mind, hopefully with some sense of humor, that's what I put in my work. I work in different kinds of series, so I'm not going to show a lot of my work here. I have three images. I actually going to talk more about my work at the end of the month at CCA, if somebody wants to see more of what I do. And I have a solo exhibition in downtown San Francisco, so you could see more of my work there at Gallery Poland. But anyway, one of the formats I like to use is the book in a pre-Columbian format. Pretty much what the Mayans and the Aztecs used. Most of these books were destroyed by Catholic priests. Just one single priest, Father Diego de Landa, destroyed all of the Mayan books. There are only 3 Mayan books in the world. One is in France, the Codex Paris. One is in Spain, the Codex Madrid. And one is in Germany, the Codex Dresden. There is no Aztec books that survived the fire, even though the largest library, and I'm talking about pre-Columbian books, European arrival, because there are Aztec books that were painted immediately after the conquest, but they are totally different. They follow more the European Renaissance style. The pre-Columbian Aztec books are gone. The biggest library in the Aztec kingdom, which was built by a king, Netzahualcoyotl, or the Feather Coyote, who was a king that was against the human sacrifices. He was a poet. He was an architect, and he built up the largest library in the Americas at the time, or of the continent. Some indigenous survivors describe the library as huge rooms full of books that describe their everything from yearly events, century events. Every 52 years was their century, all the way to daily events. But also they have books of medicine, astronomy, mythology, religion. All of that was gone. When the library was burned by the priests and the soldiers, there was a mass suicide. The indigenous people were watching that. They either jump from buildings or hang themselves, and the Spaniards could not stop them. So it was a big culturicide, basically. So I'm going to start from that. I would like to show my first image. Let's see. All right. Let's see how to make it bigger here. Oh, I guess that's it. Yeah. Anyway, here we see a group of indigenous leaders that didn't want to convert to Catholicism or to Christianity, and they were executed by the Spanish priests and soldiers. There's a really interesting anecdote told by Eduardo Galeano, who is a Uruguayan writer, in his book Memories of Fire. In that he talks about an Aztec Indian who was about to be burned, and he was confronted by the priest in front of him, and they told him that if he converted to Christianity, he will go to heaven. And the Indian asked them, "Are you all going to heaven?" And the priest, the soldier said, "Yes, we're all going to heaven." So the Indians say, "Well, I don't want to go to heaven." So anyway, so I'm gonna show you the next image because I'm not gonna spend much time here. I'm sorry that it's really hard to see in that tiny side. You could see at the gallery Paul Anglin if you ask her. She has it in the back of her room. Just briefly, I'm gonna talk a little bit about this book. This book was done in 2002, right after the biggest scandal of priests molesting boys in the church, in the Catholic Church, and I think different churches, not only Catholic. But it was a big scandal, big news in this country in 2002. Right then was also the time when the war with Afghanistan had started and the war with Iraq was about to start. And there was all these things going in my head. As I said before, I have anxieties and fears about what's going on with our contemporary life. And I just decided to make a book that expressed all of that without having any other consideration. So I started on the far right. Here is the cover, is the title. It's called The Misadventures of the Romantic Animals. And I put the picture of a nun in the background. You could barely see it, but it's a human sacrifice there. I always thought especially Catholic Church, if not any other churches too, but they have so many issues with sexual repression that all of these get expressed in really violent ways. In Mexico and in Europe, in some places in France and Spain, they have found skeletons of nuns that were pregnant within walls. So that's just something well known in Mexico, and that's why I started with that page. On the edges I have images from pre-Columbian books. It moves to a center here where there's indigenous people kidnapping pilgrims. So there's kind of like a stereotype of Native Americans. Here I have a scene of war with Mexican wrestlers somehow. The whole book, in a way, is about the corruption of something spiritual, if anything. So I started making images of religious icons with images from comic books, Mexican comic books, trying to represent that kind of corruption of the spiritual. That same year, I almost got killed in a car accident, so I put a little car here. There's a car crash. As I say, I put a little Jesus here, kind of like saving the crash, the accident. Then I found another comic book from Mexico, and I did another collage. There's the word orgasm here in the middle, it's hard to read. The next page is Lincoln and Washington printing like soft porn pictures they're hanging in the back. This is a picture of Christ. Here it's hard to see from a Persian manuscript, and anyway, so it's facing some temptation here, so like in a hotel room with these piggy ladies. And then I just ended with all these military heads and pre-Columbian indigenous and whatnot. Anything again that went through my head. And I forgot about this book. I mean, it was 2002. I have shown this book so many times. I actually showed this book twice in the Bay Area last year. I had 2 solo shows, one at the Sanchez Art Center in Pacifica, and then at Galeria de la Raza. It was there. Nobody complained. The same book was shown in a group exhibition of contemporary prints by one publisher, Sharks, in Colorado. And it was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver in 2009 for 4 months, and there was 0 complaints. In October last year, the same exhibition that was at the Denver Museum of Contemporary Art opened at the Loveland Museum of Art in Loveland, Colorado. And it was pretty much invisible until a councilman from the city council saw the book and wanted to take it down. So he went back to the city council and asked for its removal. And he first, you still could remove things if they fulfill the category of pornography. And he could not have that legally defined. He lost the legal definition, and they decided not to intervene with the museum. First of all, because there is not even nudity in the book. The only page that might be a little suggestive is this one here, but there is not even nudity at all. There is no genitalia being shown. There is just some guy like showing his tongue. This guy talked to a local church. Then he talked to the Catholic League, the National Catholic League, which, by the way, according to the New York Times, is not even Catholic, because they don't get any money or get any affiliation with any Catholic institution. But it's called the Catholic League. And they began to call, local priests to picket the work, the exhibition. There was a counter-protest. The media immediately sensationalized the whole event. I began to get waves of hate mail. And it got really scary at some point. But I have to say, I don't want to generalize. Not all the religious people were evil and nasty to me. Among the people who were sending me hate mail, suddenly I got a pastor from Loveland too, who was actually very respectfully, and he asked me what my work was. Well, my work is basically about corruption of something spiritual. The best ideals in humankind get corrupted by power, but I just express myself in ways that are just close to me, and this is just how I present that. He wrote back to me and he said, "Thank you for your thoughtful explanation. If you ever come to Loveland, it would be an honor to meet you." So I said, wow, I wrote him back, I wish all Christians were like you. And we became friends. We went back, but 2 days later, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, some woman from Colorado, this truck driver drove all the way from Montana to Loveland and bought a crowbar in Loveland and went to the museum with a crowbar, and it basically went to the museum and broke the frame and destroyed the book. This is after the book had been demonized by Fox News. Fox News focused on just one page. They did the same thing they did to David Wojnarowicz. They just focused on part of the book and they generalized. And so suddenly the news were that Stanford professor makes Jesus having oral sex. That was basically wow, I did not even think about that. But that kind of distortion is really scary. Suddenly I got a sick, even after this lady destroyed my work, I got a second wave of hate mail, but every day. It was after 2 weeks, I was just looking over my shoulder everywhere. I mean, I have to talk to the Stanford police, I have San Francisco police. Next thing is just to buy a pit bull. I don't know, but it gets really. I mean, you get your instincts suddenly react. I even got like. Well, I could divide in three the hate mail I got. One was xenophobic, or being Mexican. The other was homophobic. Some people thought I was gay too. I mean, I take that as a compliment. I have great gay friends. We went to their weddings. Some of my best neighbors are gay. They actually celebrate Christmas too. They have lights all over their house. But that shows you how much people could hate you without knowing you, without knowing anything about you. There's this culture of hate that is out there. And I felt like I was in front of a lynching mob in the internet. For the first time I felt I should be invisible. I don't want to be known by anybody. I even told my wife I maybe should change my name. I told her maybe I should use your last name, and she started like laughing and crying, from laughing, and I was crying out of sadness, but she was totally could not believe it. And then 2 months later, the David Wojnarowicz thing happened at the Smithsonian. And who was behind the whole thing again? The same Catholic League that boycotted the exhibition in London was doing it at the Smithsonian. But then I say, thank you, David, wherever you are. You took the spotlight somewhere else. The Smithsonian is a bigger fish than the Lowland Museum. And the good news today is that David Wojnarowicz is immune to hate mail. So this thing is more easily available to everybody. The artist doesn't have to be worried about he being in the middle of a cultural war. And I think there is a lot of issues that affect all of us. Not only the First Amendment that could be taken away from any of us by hate or violence. I mean, I don't take it for granted. But it's something to think about. Where are we going from here? It's not just that history repeats itself. It seems more like we're going backwards than forwards in some cases. And I think we're just living through a backlash after the election of President Obama. It seems like there's all this rhetoric of hate and violence and hunting politicians that express themselves in events like last week. So it's just something to really think about. And we can talk more about it when we go to the panel, but I don't want to take more of your time. But this is basically my experience. Thank you.
Is actually 19th century literature and culture, and so today I feel like I'm getting out of my ivory tower and actually look at some of the issues of art and censorship that I study in my scholarship and get a chance to actually make hopefully some very direct connections to what we're talking about today. But I'm asking you to sort of bear with me because I will actually take you into a very different kind of realm, the 19th century, and actually also somebody, the work of somebody who is obviously, when you hear his name, you will recognize his name, Oscar Wilde, who was actually seen as both sort of an avatar of the queer liberation movement in the 20th century, which is sort of historically debatable if that's true or not for Oscar Wilde himself, but that's how he's been seen. And then also, of course, the issue of censorship that's attached to his name. So let me just get my bearings here and make sure that I pull up my images. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to take you into the example of Oscar Wilde's Salome, and actually there are two kind of parts to this example that I want to focus on today. The first one I'll introduce to you the idea, the main ideas and the censorship of this play that he wrote, Oscar Wilde's Salome, which is from 1891, and then I will actually make a very quick jump into the 20th century to a trial that happened in 1918 that involved a scantily clad dancer named Allan, who basically got censored because of her own art, but also because of Oscar Wilde. So I'll talk about that, and then at the end I'll have a little connection to the topic that we're here to discuss today. So first let me introduce to you a little bit some ideas about Oscar Wilde's Salome, just tell you a little bit about what it was about. It was an avant-garde drama written originally in French, in the style of French symbolism in 1891. Wilde at the time was actually residing in Paris, which was of course the big city of avant-garde art, at least as far as he saw it. He thought it was much more progressive than London at the time. And by writing this play in French and also in the style of the French symbolists, he actually was trying to align himself with this avant-garde art of people like Mallarmé or Maurice Maeterlinck or Joris Carl-Brismont. Salome also tapped into the very popular fin de siècle literary and artistic subject evoke of the biblical theme of Salome, the princess of Judea who dances for and receives the head of St. John the Baptist, whom Wilde actually calls Euchanan in this play. St. John the Baptist was the precursor of Christ, and of course there's the biblical subject that was disseminated through and kind of made it into the Western canon via the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. Wilde also knew and loved the paintings by Gustave Moreau, and I'm just going to bring up one of them here. This is also symbolist, of course, from 1876, L'Apparition. And you see Salome there and the severed head of St. John the Baptist. Aubrey Beardsley also famously supplied the naughty Art Nouveau images, the illustrations for the book version of Wilde's Salome, which actually came out in 1894. The story of Salome actually contained much moral and religious dynamite, with a sexy, seductive dance in front of Herod's court and the murder of a religious leader, and the cunning triumph of a mother-daughter femme fatale. But Wilde topped all of that with his notorious changes to the theme. First, just to kind of briefly recap the play, he actually made Salome fall in love with John the Baptist. She woos him, she tries to seduce him, he's a chaste yet fiery, rhetoric-laden kind of prophet, and she gets obsessed with kissing him, his red, red mouth. So that's the first thing. Then he also gives Salome the blame in John the Baptist's death. When the prophet rejects her, she resolves to kill him just so she can finally have her wish to possess his head and kiss his lips. She dances for Herod only so she can demand as a reward the Baptist's head and do with that what she will, which basically means kissing it over and over again. And then in the play's scandalous finale, Salome actually kneels and writhes on the floor, enraptured and ecstatic. She kisses the bloody head again and again while reciting a long love monologue. And I'm actually going to show you an image from the opera, which is based on Wilde's play by Richard Strauss from 1905, which is very faithful to the play. And this is Maria Ewing in Salome's final aria. You can see the bloody head in her hands. Actually, when I was at this, I actually was there for this opera production, and she's basically wearing nothing underneath this red robe, and in some very inopportune moment, or actually I should probably say lucky moment for the audience, her robe opened. And in some very interesting posture there. So it was very much a combination of sexuality on the stage and then this obviously sort of necrophilic moment. So you already see here, and I want to mark this as one thing that was important for the censorship of Wild Salome later, the connection between sexuality and sort of transgressive sexuality and blasphemy. So religion and sex, these two things, we'll get back to that later. So in the finale of Wilde's play and also in the opera, a shocked and disgusted Herod, her stepfather, looks on and orders, "Kill that woman." But Salome is killed at her highest moment of triumph. So the moral of the play and also the opera is really, kind of, well, I don't even want to say wishy-washy. It's a very unexpected kind of moral. It's not an orthodox kind of moral. Wilde does not censor Salome with this death, the order to kill her, but he seems to suggest that she has achieved what she wanted. That transgressing in this way, as I've described sexually and religiously and morally, has actually been a good thing, and sort of given her the experience of freedom and satisfaction. So that in itself is kind of obviously very shocking kind of idea. And the play was supposed to be a shocker, but no one actually anticipated that was actually banned before it ever reached the stage. It was in rehearsals with the famous Sarah Bernard, the French actress, in London in 1891, in the summer of 1891, when it was abruptly taken off the list of the theater and basically banned by the theatrical censor, a guy named Edward Pigott, whom George Bernard Shaw described as a walking compendium of vulgar insular prejudice. Pigott cited actually an obscure 16th century law that prohibited the representation of biblical characters on stage. It was actually a really obscure law that had hardly been enforced, and it was very clear that he had just looked, he was just looking for a reason and a way to sort of ban this play. And this is actually true because as he told, as we have found out, from a private letter that he wrote to a friend, it was really the play's mix, as I mentioned before, of sex and religion that made him censored. I'm just going to give you a brief excerpt from this letter. where he describes Salome. It is a miracle of impudence. Salome's love turns to fury because John will not let her kiss him in the mouth. He italicizes these 3 words, in the mouth. And in the last scene, where she brings in his head, if you please, on a charger, she does kiss his mouth in a paroxysm of sexual despair. The piece is written in French. Let me say that again. The piece is written in French, half biblical, half pornographic, by Oscar Wilde himself. Imagine the average British public's reception of it. So the censor's decision actually came as a complete surprise to Wilde, who was at the peak years of his career. The kinds of things he was writing at the time, the importance of being earnest, the picture of Dorian Gray, all these very famous plays. He was kind of really the darling of London society at the time, so nobody had expected this. And then, of course, 4 years later, you may be familiar with at least the title of the title's been given to these trials that he was involved in that basically ruined his career. In 1895, there was a series of 3 trials for quote-unquote gross indecency, which is basically he got condemned and sent to prison for acts of homosexual love. And so, in 1900, very tragically, because of health problems he had incurred in prison, he actually passed away. So going from 1891, from this peak of his career, to 1900, sort of dying in disgrace, really, in France again, was quite a terrible change. When Salome was banned in 1891, Wilde famously declared that he wanted to emigrate to France and actually become a French citizen. And we can only hope that, if he had done that, actually, he would have avoided, this is the irony of history, he would have avoided the whole gross indecency trials. In historical hindsight, after these trials, the banned Salome was read not only as an artwork that was religiously and sexually transgressive, but also, and this may be important for our panel today and for our discussion later, as a secret clue to Wilde's queerness, to his supposed perversity, quote unquote, and queerness, which of course in 1891 was not known. So in hindsight, 1895, looking back on the banned Salome, people went like, so we could have seen it then. So that's a very interesting and very problematic way of viewing art, of course, that we should probably get into in the panel discussion later. So moving on to briefly give you a little bit of, in a different context, we're actually moving ahead a few years, as I promised you, to the so-called Pemberton Billing trial from 1918. The kinds of things that Wilde had experienced, and this idea of queer sexuality and avant-garde art as a connection came to haunt this specific person here, a dancer, a Canadian-American dancer named Maud Allan. In 1908, she actually had risen to international fame with an astonishing solo dance piece that 2 of her sort of famous teachers or models were Isadora Duncan and Louis Fuller. Some of you may be familiar with their names. This piece was called The Vision of Salome, and it was actually based on Wilde's play, on the 2 transgressive highlights of that play, the dance and this, the monologue to the severed head. Because, despite the ban in England, Wilde's play was actually well known because of its book publication that I mentioned before in 1894, and also because of the great success of Strauss's opera all over the world at that point. Maud Allan was the first to publicly perform the role of Salome in a dance version that also had feminist overtones, and this may be one reason why I would suggest actually her art was censored later as well, not just because of the sexuality and the avant-garde art, but also because of this controversial feminism that that people felt it contained. She was very beautiful, as you can see, and she was scantily clad for this performance. And this is only understandable in the context of 19th century culture. It was very scandalous because she actually danced barefoot. Oh my goodness. Which was very unusual for the time, and signified eroticism. So this in part explains her, her success in the dance hall culture of the time. She was rumored to be a lesbian, which is an important kind of thing for the trial that followed later. But at the time that I'm showing you here, in 1908, her dance version, the King, Edward VII, at the time, was actually very much, I wouldn't say in love with her, but he really appreciated her dancing. So she sort of had, royal protection, so to speak, from the press. That unfortunately did not last very long. I'm going to take you into a different context now. 1914 to 1918, World War I. At the end of this time in Britain, there was basically, people were concerned that the arts and, so-called perverse art might actually be, impacting Britain's war performance. So I can only very briefly sketch this trial, but what I wanted to tell you about is the case that involved Maud Allan. There was actually a newspaper piece called The Cult of the Clitoris, alluding to Maud Allan's supposed lesbianism. And she was actually part of a Salome production in 1918, and people basically used this as a platform. The right-wing, political right-wing, used this as a platform to kind of stage almost like a mock trial around Maud Allan and the idea of Salome that would basically just use this piece of art to argue that art would have to be contained and be kind of censored. I will just give you one very brief excerpt from one of the arguments during the trial, because I know I'm almost out of time here. This is the guy who actually put this trial in motion, Noel Pemberton Billing, who talked about the corruption and the perversity of her, and talked about Oscar Wilde in this context. So this is what he said. This social leper, Oscar Wilde, had founded a cult of sodomy in this country and traveled from end to end of it, perverting youth wherever he could. He was not satisfied, even that his evil influence should die with him. He left behind his works so that his crimes may be perpetrated even after he was dead. It is calculated scientific filth, and also calculated to spread disease of the mind, which is the most difficult disease of all to cure. And one of the ironies of the trial is that actually Wilde's former lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, was involved in it as well. He gave testimony against Wilde that really, spoke against him. And one of the things that I wanted to just point out briefly at the end here, as I come to my closing, is that he actually made this connection between art, sort of perverse, quote-unquote, perverse art, and this idea that somehow in this art, like a disease, there is danger that we have to kind of find and diagnose and basically do something against. And I'm just going to close with this quote here from Lord Alfred Douglas, which is of course a terrible quote, but also very provocative. This is Lord Alfred Douglas, keep in mind, Wilde's former lover, now homophobe. This is what he said. It says about Wilde's art and about Maud Allan indirectly. Sodomites, those sort of people, always refer to revolting things under pretty names. They try to disguise the horribleness of the action by giving it such names. They say beautiful, classic, and so on. They will not speak of it by the outspoken English name. They disguise it. With those sort of people, evil is their good. Everything is topsy-turvy. Physical is spiritual. Spiritual is physical, and so on. It is a perversion and an aversion of everything. So if this is the argument, and these are my final closing questions, how will one be able to tell the real beauty, the spirituality or truth of art from the evil within? How will one be safe from this disease? How can one inoculate oneself against the contagious disease of perverse art? And so this is one of the things I want to suggest we may talk about at the end today in the panel discussion, what it is that we're afraid of with this kind of art. Why is it that, for example, religion and queer sexuality have to be apart? Why can we not use the one through the other? Why are we so afraid of putting these two things together? And as we heard today, and hopefully also in my historical example, there are very real people for whom this has very real consequences. Thank you very much.
Honestly, on my way down, I thought, I don't consider myself very cultured. I've been to maybe 2 or 3 art museums. I did find it fascinating and it was educational and informative, but I think I'm realizing after listening to the panel that I've been afraid of art myself. And I thought, I wonder what in the world do they want to hear from the likes of me? And then I realized, well, I've lived my life censored. And this isn't the Renee Huff show by any means, but I thought that I might just point out that I have Christmas and lots of lights at my house. And hopefully I'll get to make friends with you as well after profit. But I'm an African-American woman. I'm born and raised in Houston, Texas. I came out when I went, actually to my entire high school class, when I was elected vice president of my class. I congratulated them on being such a conservative school in Jersey Village for electing an now openly gay lesbian. And I was promptly sent to the office. I think I got days off for that. At any rate, later I went on to become the first and only African-American female supervisor, and still, unfortunately, the history of Harris County Precinct 4. I have a lot of friends there, but there hasn't been a lot of progress. That was in '99. And so I wondered, what am I going to tell this esteemed audience that I don't feel qualified to speak before? And then I realized, as the other speakers spoke, actually, I'm probably the most uniquely positioned to speak on this matter. I used to think that Shakespeare's quote, I want to get feedback, pardon me. Shakespeare's quote, and so I don't slaughter it. The first thing we should do is kill all the lawyers. And for some reason, I have a fondness. Okay, I'll comply. I have a fondness of joining professions that I'd like to improve. So I became a police officer so that I could pay for school, knowing that I wanted to go to law school. But I thought at the time, naively so, that real life experience would have great applicability. I can't speak. It would apply, I'll try another way, very well to academia. And I was very, very, very wrong. I almost failed criminal law, in fact, trying to apply real world experience to hypotheticals. Nonetheless, I've since learned, now that I have begun a career and a focus on civil rights and criminal defense, surprisingly enough. I can't believe it still. But I'm realizing that I didn't get to read a lot of the books that you guys got to read on the left coast, as I lovingly call it now. Censorship results in a 35 3/4-year-old woman standing and speaking at Stanford and admitting that there's parts of this country, and this is being recorded, so I will speak freely and exercise my First Amendment rights, that don't get the memo. We don't get to know that there's freedom out there. I am jumping all around because I'm not using notes, because I don't have a speech prepared. This is real life, and so I'm just telling you. I started at South Texas College of Law, and ultimately was at the top of my class, so I transferred to the University of Minnesota Law School. And that was the first time that I ever held a woman's hand while I walked outside. And that was one of the best feelings. I'll never forget the feeling. And it hadn't occurred to me that I'd always been in a vehicle when I held my former partner's hand, my ex-wife, her hand. And when we walked down the street, and felt really special that no one had anything to say, because I can listen to 7 conversations and respond to each one. And so I unfortunately hear nigger, dyke, and a lot of other things. I don't need to go on. In Texas, but we didn't in Minneapolis, and it was liberating for that formerly Northwest Forest Republican Women's Association card-carrying member in anti-affirmative action, former Corporal and Renee Huff. So it's been quite a journey, to say the least. Now I work with John Burris, fighting for civil rights and protecting the people and citizens who I believe on some occasions violated their rights, their constitutional rights. On one I know, because I was written up for it. It was unintentional, a rookie error, improper seizure of crack cocaine. But at any rate, I guess what I'd like to say is I'm finally awake and concerned for all of us. And I don't think that it's just the people that stand before podiums and speak at fancy universities. At least to me, it is. I feel fancy right now, actually. I do. And honored and humbled. But we all have to stand up and start asking questions. And I had not seen the film that we reviewed tonight until tonight. And I didn't take First Amendment law in law school either. But I got an A in con law, so I think we'll be okay. And I'm proud of it, if you can't tell. But the reason that King Henry VI suggested that the first thing we must do is to kill all the lawyers is because that was the surest way to chaos and tyranny. Even then, was to remove the guardians of independent thinking. And so then I realized I finally picked a profession where I'm not the bad guy. This is good. And then I realized, Professor, that, and I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Enrique. Gracias, muy amable. Lo siento. That Enrique, as he pointed out, there's oppression. There is a groupthink, a group mentality. And I can't quote you, but you said something to the effect that people in power basically keep us mindless and keep us silent. And I was moved by the piece. And what I do know about the law as it applies here, I can get to it just a moment, is that when the Supreme Court has only this to say about pornography, and I'm quoting Chief Justice Warren from Jacobellis v. Ohio, "I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, hardcore pornography. And perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it. And the motion picture involved in this case is not that." So what's the threshold? How do we know when the government tells us what we're allowed to see? I don't think that makes much sense personally, but I'm just one woman with one opinion. But I think if groupthink is the order of the day, then perhaps we better start creating groups of our own and thinking in a different direction. So the Constitution has this to say about the First Amendment. "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances." There's different ways of construing the law. You have strict constructionists such as Scalia, and you have others on the bench increasingly, so being more what some coin as activists, others call free thinking. And I'm lucky because my time is soon to be up and I'll be in a position to answer questions, which I feel much better than giving speeches, I fear. But I'll jump down to a point that 2 points actually. one element of pornography is if it's taken as a whole, and I believe this is the most important and essential, because if you kick this leg out of the four corners of the elements of the prima facie case, the table falls, which means they lose. The censorship loses. So as taken as a whole, does the material lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value? I'm no culture art purveyor, if that's even what you guys call yourselves. I don't know. I'm just a girl from Texas that moved to the Bay Area and is trying to figure life out now. But what I do know is that the films that the pieces that I've watched or looked at of Enrique's, intriguing, moving, and definitely artistic, if, in my humble opinion. I hope that does you honor. It's a compliment from me. I'm trying to make one anyway. In the film, I can't help it. I'm a Southerner, and Stevie Wonder can see that that's got some artistic credibility there. Forgive me, pardon me, Stevie, much respect. So, my favorite quote, and I don't know how much it applies here, but since it's timely, I'll share it. And it's simply this: darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And that's the great late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So I'd like to wish him a happy birthday, or Martin Luther King Day rather, and I'll be available for questions. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Let's see. I'm going to be showing images, mostly that go with what I'm talking about, but there's a couple of images that I threw in because they're examples of contemporary art using Christian iconography. Hi, Gina.
Hi, Dorian.
Okay, so when art by some of my heroes, including the NEA Four, lots of people from the culture wars, those of the past like Oscar Wilde and Enrique, when their work is censored or attacked, when they receive vitriol now via email that threatens their lives or their ability to get funding and recognition is threatened, I worry for all of us, and frankly for myself. What becomes of culture making when freedom of expression is undermined? I'm going to talk about how this affects us all, as well as how it affects me personally. The history of censorships is politics, as we know. The voices and images condemned as obscene are those who challenge the powerful establishment of a culture that doesn't want to look at itself. Our voices, we the disenfranchised rabble-rousers, are easy targets. The right wing likes to make examples out of us, especially if our art addresses queerness, racism, feminism, or takes Christian iconography into its own context, as in the case of David Wojnarowicz's film and Enrique's Codex. When politicians threaten funding at government museums, this has huge repercussions. First, it lets us know that we are not considered the right kind of Americans by powerful people in and out of government. The loss of funding makes many other public institutions afraid to showcase work by LGBT artists with obvious queer content. Hide-Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture is the first show at an American government museum to focus primarily on work of, or half and half-ish, on work of LGBT people, and even there, the curators were not allowed to use words like gay, LGBT, homosexual, or queer in its title. Pressure at the top quickly trickles down. Decreases in spaces for overtly queer work by established artists not only will keep them from furthering their career successes, it pushes them down into spaces that mid-career and emerging artists like me would otherwise be competitive in. And less opportunities in these venues makes a less developed resume. This affects not just our career as exhibiting artists, it makes us less likely to get future opportunities for teaching at the college level and tenure track positions. It means work with sexual content and queer content is less likely to get artists much needed funding from grants and residencies. The same political pushes decrease funding to arts organizations who consider people with my particular experience an asset. This doesn't just affect me, an LGBT and emerging queer artist. What happens to me career-wise impacts LGBT youth who meet me at the less prestigious community venues where I may be relegated. Young queer people's estimations of their future possibilities, whether or not they want a life in the arts. What do they think when they see a queer artist in her mid-40s who makes work they like and even has a fancy degree from Stanford and works in a warehouse? Or drives a super shuttle van? That is exactly what I was doing the first time I laid eyes on the Stanford campus. Why should they be ambitious? Why should they stop getting high? I want to talk a bit about queer art as culture making. This gets undermined too when our work cannot get shown. When I say that queer art contributes to queer culture making, I mean that we recognize portrayals of people like us and those we know in it. We see how it has influenced our people's self-expression, and we can see something of our own past histories and present lives. Growing up, most of us find out about our family and cultural history from stories older relatives tell us. And we learn about our history through family and being a part of local communities or churches or mosques or synagogues in my case. We learn our history and the idiosyncrasies of our people, the heroes, the food, the humor, the arts. But for queers, this is much less likely to be observed growing up. We piece things together as we get older. I remember seeing drag queens on roller skates at the Thanksgiving Day parade in New York City when I was little. They had balloons, glitter, wore lots of makeup and bright colors and sparkly things. I didn't know the term drag queen, and I was too young to know that there were names for certain kinds of people. I had no idea that the sparkles and glitter and bright colors, things that appear in a lot of my work, would someday be something of my people. An obvious example of artist culture making is the drawings of Tom of Finland. His work was inspired by the men he lusted after, men who were doing physical labor outdoors and in the military during his youth. These men already existed, but his work continues to inspire certain homosexual men to live up to a particular standard of rugged masculinity and hotness. In the leather bars and SM clubs of the 70s and 80s, the men looked like Tom's men. Even the men who did not know the source of the look wore it. In Catherine Opie's early work, we see queer people who are the dominant culture's garbage photographed as if they are royalty. There's an extreme tenderness to this, even in one of the self-portraits that people find shocking. What is carved into her back? The normative desire for home and family. When we see ourselves reflected in art, and we are people who don't get to have that experience often, there can be a profound sense of recognition. I don't especially see myself in Mapplethorpe's photographs of the SM culture. As far as I know, Cynthia Slater, who was a nexus for the leather community of San Francisco in the 70s and 80s, is the only leather woman he photographed. But these images do say a lot about the subculture I am a part of. And for the next generation of perverts who won't get to know many of Mapplethorpe's generation, there's a lot of information in the photos about whom their ancestors were, as well as what has changed and what continues. Excluding us from museums excludes us from some aspects of having a visible history. Where am I? Where are people like me? It's not okay for museums to be one more place where our histories are silenced. Most queers with knowledge of art history know that we are visually in there. From Grecian urns to Caravaggio's boy bitten by a lizard. There was a time when only those wealthy enough to be educated and lucky enough to learn the right things had any idea that queers had a history. As an artist, I don't count myself amongst the likes of Mapplethorpe and Wanarovich. I don't find the comparisons very useful, and I don't have that kind of ego. On the other hand, as a queer, I am close to them. They are mine. Both their work and their fight, living and posthumously, against censorship have contributed significantly to my culture. I am constantly aware of the negative potential in my subject matter. Every time I submit work, I wonder if pigs fucking or a bear peeing on a deer will be considered with any seriousness. There are many opportunities for shows and residencies that are simply unavailable to me. It would be easy to back off of queer sex, and I can't say it's never a temptation, but if it resulted in success, that might be harder to take than rejection. The only resource that I can see to this situation that I feel good about is to go the other way, to be vigilant in my filth. Thank you.
What I think we can do now, because we are really, we want you to be able to engage in this conversation. It's gone on with a lot of presentations, so it's later than we probably would have planned. So I want to, first of all, thank you for sticking out. And I want to thank the panel also for really kind of coming to this with a lot of interesting perspectives. So I'm going to ask the first question, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor, but one of the things that I found really fascinating is why it is that the films we saw are not the film that's in the exhibition. I mean, one of the things that we generally tend to think is that there's an original or an originary object that we can really attribute to the artist. And while, Larry, I think you sort of explained, well, nobody would have looked at it. It would have been invisible for another reason if it was too long. But it's kind of, it has some addition of words or a soundtrack anyway, which changes the experience of whatever it was that was found. The artist was not there to narrate how to show it. And so one of the things that's just so interesting here is that the controversy is about something that actually may not be the thing that it would have been if the artist could have preserved it. We don't know what the role of the curator was. It just seems like, so one of the things that passed through my mind was, is there a different copyright, as far as you might know, to the film that wasn't shown? Does somebody own that, or how does that work?
All I know is that the estate gave their permission for these changes to be made, and I assume that the estate has the right to do that legally. I don't know who the estate is, but the estate did give their permission. I think that this is an example of an intersubjective something. I don't know if I would call it an artwork, but it's an intersubjective expression that should not have been censored. I'm opposed, regardless of what it is. The government should not have stepped in and demanded that it be removed. The head of the Smithsonian should not have taken it out. There are some very interesting questions, sort of if we get beyond the question of censorship, of what this object is. It wouldn't be so much of an issue to me if it hadn't been so much of an issue to David Wanarovich that he took on this very subject of the integrity of the artist's vision in the last months of his life. He chose to sue. He could have spent the last months of his life doing a lot of things than spending it in court. So clearly this was something that meant something to him specifically.
So it's a bit of a mystery. I'm trying to imagine, so please, yeah, enlighten us.
I have just like a little bit of information about that, just from what I spoke about Jonathan. So because I've been in contact with Jonathan, I've talked to him briefly about this. Just as far as I know, all I know about, I don't know anything about the copyright, I don't know you know, sort of, I know that the estate is housed at PPOW Gallery in New York. They were the ones that gave them permission to edit the video. The video is edited for length, not for content. They did their very best to represent every single scene that's in the full 7 minutes within the 4-minute version. At least this is what I have understood to be true. I know that they didn't entirely remove the masturbation scene. They did cut it down, but at least Jonathan's intention was that you would sort of understand what was happening or what was supposed to happen without the full sort of graphics. I also just wanted to clarify one other thing that was said earlier. The video is not up on the National Portrait Gallery website. There was a dummy website that was made by someone else that looks like the National Portrait website. Yeah. So be careful when you're looking. Yeah. So the National Portrait Gallery has not yet done that. But
Thank you. Is there a comment or question? Yeah, okay.
I do have this letter from, very quickly, letter from PPOW in response to a question of why it was shortened. The curators included photographic works by the artist, but also wanted to include something that showed David's activist involvement. That has to do with the addition of the soundtrack. They requested to edit it to a shorter version primarily because there were more quote-unquote graphic scenes of masturbation that they thought would be considered too risky to show.
So that's sort of self-censorship. I don't know exactly how this works, but I want to kind of enable those of you who might have questions, use the mic and then you can share that. Are there others?
I'll be loud. Perhaps, I feel like we could distinguish a little more clearly the different sort of kinds of censorship we've heard about today. So we heard historically about essentially legislative and executive censorship when Britain was censoring the stage, right? Which no longer exists because of the 1960s. Court censorship is pretty passive, like in that pornography case, and Warhol Holmes said, we're not going to decide what art is, right? We want to back off of that. We're just jurists. We don't know what we're talking about. But we've got this new situation, and then we get individual censorship that we heard about, where individual acts to repress freedom of expression. But now we're in this position where the legislative and executive control over the censorship control comes through funding. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that and how private funding actually has a weird relationship here because the exhibit's entirely privately funded, am I correct? And it's in fact just that it's housed at the National Gallery that made the threat. National Portrait Gallery, that it brought the print up. But the exhibit, I think I read, did not receive any government funding per se. So can you hear a little bit more about funding role here?
I've actually asked to take this question because that was the final note that I wanted to speak about. It is frustrating if you're on the side of, foremost I should say that the First Amendment applies to the states through the 14th Amendment. And you only have standing if it was the government that directly inflicted or caused the injury, as it said, caused the harm or injury that resulted in damages, actual damages. But it's called a carrot and a stick approach that's being applied to the private entities, organizations, institutions, museums, galleries, etc., who would otherwise display the art, display what's ultimately censored by the government and funders taking an end run around, circumventing the process. They use a carrot and a stick. It's also used with other state funding. It's how our system works right now. And the carrot is to coax the would-be presenters of the subject away from authenticity. And the stick is to beat us into submission. And either way, they make an ass of us.
So what's the, I think,
Is that not responsive?
what's the legal stick these days? Because I see
The legal stick is what you identified, even as not being a jurist, right? They don't get the funding, so you don't get the show. That's the stick.
There is a legal precedent already in New York when former Mayor Giuliani had a legal fight with the Brooklyn Museum when the Brooklyn Museum was exhibiting Sensation, the collection of Saatchi. Included one artist, Chrysophili, who had a portrait of Virgin Mary, and the painting was on top of elephant dung, and the mayor got totally offended by it. So he decided to cut funding completely any money from the city to the Brooklyn Museum will be cut. And they went to a legal fight, and Mayor Giuliani lost the legal fight on the grounds that even though the word was controversial, it still is protected by the First Amendment, and that was it. I don't know, what the Smithsonian will have to face if now there is more like a different political climate, but a legal precedent usually helps the next decision. So, if they went into a legal fight, as far as we know, the First Amendment still protects controversial work. I think there is still an NEA exception that was passed in the 1990s thanks to Jesse Helms and very conservative politicians, where museums cannot show pornography or defined as obscene work that arouses, creates sexual arousal. And I think that's still on. So, but as long as it's not that, I think legally it will happen like what happened in New York, in Brooklyn. It should be protected by the First Amendment.
If I may have a rebuttal. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about that, and I think that that's why a number of my colleagues and you guys obviously are concerned, because it depends on what precedent is to be applied, right? Federally speaking, we're dealing with the Constitution that applies abroad to all of the states, arguably so. But when I'm talking about circumventing the system, I'm talking about cases, well, in this case, it will come to court. But as you say, in fact, the courts and the jurists have quite a way of reaching the decision that they choose, and I don't know necessarily that, or leaving it ambiguous for the threshold, if we agree there. Can we? Okay. And again, because I appear before the jurist, I try to use a modicum of just being diplomatic. But I'm not so sure that, given the chance and considering the political environment that we're currently in, that it's just straight away that it's not censored.
I'll jump, sorry. Actually, 2 points I wanted to make. First, I had a chance to see the show in December, and I just wanted to first make the point that there are a lot of interesting pieces in the exhibition itself, which I was saying I had a chance to see the show in December, and I wanted to make the point first that there are a lot of artworks in the exhibition, for example, paintings by Thomas Eakins, pieces by Robert Rauschenberg, which sort of get at the overarching mission of hide and seek without being so explicit. So I think it's important to consider the broader context of the exhibition and the sort of subtlety that the curators have applied. But more to the point, and maybe a direct question to the panelists, I'd like to raise the point about the broader economic and political stakes of the circumstances surrounding the censorship. And I'm specifically interested in any of your responses to something like the response that the Warhol Foundation produced, which was basically to say, as a result of this, we are going to not provide funding for Smithsonian shows. And I'm actually a little bit unsure where that process stands as of today. I know there was something that was sort of in flux. But this gets to this last point about the systems that are created. Because in essence, then it starts to create something of two systems, right? You essentially have shows which are deemed acceptable at the Smithsonian and receive the blessings of something like the NEA, and then you have a series of exhibitions at very different kind of museums and institutions which are not. And so I'm sort of wondering about this possibility of sort of two very different artistic networks sort of in flux. And if anyone wants to comment on the Warhol and other responses, that would be great.
have a second mic, but I'm not sure how to work it, so that's why.
I believe that the Warhol ban, if you can call that, is in effect. I think that the condition was the return of this, this video. If the video was returned, the funding would be reinstituted, and I don't believe it has been returned. You know, I think that the possible future that you outline could come to pass, particularly in the difference between the Smithsonian and everyone else. I mean, the NEA is not really a factor here as far as I'm aware. It's just the Smithsonian is an arm of the government. It is in its entirety a government phenomenon, and so everything that it does is de facto dependent on the government. And so I think this is the last show like this we're going to see for a long time at the Smithsonian. And you know, people can vote with their feet. I mean, you know, more opportunities elsewhere, I suppose. I mean, it's a shame, of course. And I think the show, by the way, I haven't seen it. The catalog is fantastic. I wrote the director of the museum an email the day I opened the catalog, and this was before any of this was a controversy, and I said, congratulations on a fantastic show, you should be proud. I expect you'll be hearing from people who feel otherwise, but at least one person thinks this is a great show. But I fear that this whole episode will have a tremendous chilling effect, certainly on government museums and galleries, and probably beyond that.
I cannot speak specifically to the Warhol response, but I have a footnote that I wanted to kind of bring up as a related point and something to maybe think about a little bit more. What I find so interesting is this whole connection between money, which by the way is so ironic if you think of the actual piece and, you know, Fire in My Belly's use of the coins in there. You know, it's just kind of chilling to think about that in this context. But what I wanted to raise is this issue of the connection of money and the debate about the status of art in society. And actually last night I hold this on my lap because I wanted to read you something. I was trying to sort of educate myself a little bit more about this controversy, and so I YouTubed it and found a couple of really interesting things. Well, you know, if there's anything interesting on Fox News, actually, you know, excerpts from Fox News interviews with people like Eric Cantor and a Representative Jack Kingston, Republican congressman from Georgia. And they're talking about this idea of funding, public funding, and what it's supposed to do. And I'm just going to read you the two quotes that I wrote down here. Eric Cantor called the hide-seek exhibit, quote, an outrageous use of taxpayer money. Taxpayers have a right to expect that the museum will uphold common standards of decency. And then the second one, Representative Jack Kingston, Republican congressman from Georgia, called for a congressional investigation into the museum's public funding, and here's the quote. This is the end of his rant on Fox News. It's a pro-gay exhibit, which is fine. Again, with private dollars, you can do whatever you want, but this is public. And this is a museum that is supposed to be bringing us up to higher standards. So my big question is, I guess for all of us, is why is that? You know, why public funding and why common standards of decency? And the reason I'm bringing this up is because my own work in the 19th century is about the debate about exactly that, the status of art in society. And in the 19th century, the culture wars of the 19th century were very much about this idea that art is supposed to somehow, you know, make us better human beings and elevate the standards of decency by being, you know, moral and religious. So it sounds to me like when I listen to Cantor and Kingston, for example, it sounds to me we're still in the 19th century.
Yes.
This is supposed. It works. Okay. This is actually a question about the work rather than the censorship. I wondered how folks felt about the fact that the AIDS experience in the 80s is being represented predominantly by Mexican imagery.
Good question.
Well, in the piece that is most clearly by David Wojnarowicz, I'm not clear that it's about AIDS, it's about Mexico. So in the 13-minute piece, which David Wojnarowicz signed, I don't recall seeing much that leads me to think that this is specifically about AIDS.
Thank you, because it has been represented otherwise, and that was the original what I was saying.
Also, I think, I mean, I identified with Warhol's artist. He's living in a context. He was living in Mexico at the time. And most of the images, a lot of the images, not most, but maybe a lot of the images were focusing on death and killing, either, or some very oppressive images of machismo maybe, or but there were a lot of images of, there was Coatlicue, the goddess of life and death. I think perhaps, I mean, that's a wild guess, like anybody's wild guess maybe, but perhaps David was thinking about his own life and seeing life through the eyes of death, basically. And in Mexico, it's a strong culture since ancient times where life is a dream, basically, and when you die, you wake up. That's basically in an ancient poem. And it's very different than the Western sense of life and death, where death is scary and you don't want to think about it. Life is beautiful, you have to enjoy life, and it's different than the dance macabre, where death is the equalizer and everybody dances with death, but it's kind of like a scary thing. In Mexico, it's not just Day of the Dead. It's since ancient times, the presence of death is in a way just a complement of life. And when, especially in indigenous towns, when somebody dies, people actually celebrate. They have like a party, and it's because that person just was born somewhere. It's the ancient belief. So life begins with death. It's a totally different concept. I don't know if David Warhol knew about this or not, but certainly he was sensitive about that, and I think he was capturing it through his camera. I mean, that's my personal feeling, just growing up in that city that he was filming in Mexico City. I hope that makes sense.
So thank you for this wonderful talk, first of all. And this is a departure as well, but my question is about the critiques from the Catholic League and the representatives and people like that. And I'm going to botch a couple quotes, but hopefully I'll get my point across. I mean, they botch a lot of quotes too. So it's particularly the response where they brought it out of America, and they said, well, this is critics of the exhibit, that is, said you wouldn't say this. If this was a piece about Muhammad, you wouldn't put it in there because we have fear of that, and you wouldn't say this about their God. How can you say this about our God? And I'm paraphrasing, but I love this this discourse that they brought up because I think it's like the craziest thing ever. That the same people, and I'm going to use Fox News as kind of the window to see them through. The same people that can say this on Fox News are the same people that on Fox News would create the biggest Islamophobia ever over the quote-unquote barbarism that they see in reacting this way out of religion or using Muhammad in this way. The same, I imagine that the Catholic League, when this was going on with Danish cartoons, was saying, look at what they're doing over there. This is barbarism, and so now they get to use it in their defense. And whether it's to drive, and maybe they're not, making the same, committing the same actions that were committed in Holland or whatever. But whether Fox News is driving truck drivers to destroy Professor Chigoya's art, or they get to use it in their defense in some way to strike the same fear. I think that's for me, one of the most interesting discourses to come out of this, and one of the most crazy things ever. And I wanted to see if you had anything to say about that, and the use of religion in that way.
If I might say, a lot of my hate mail was, why don't you make Muhammad exactly the same thing? Like maybe 1/3 of the hate mail I got. Why don't you make Muhammad? First of all, I did not even portray Christ in my work. I told the press that was a collage. It's not, plus it's a mix of things. I just mix cut and paste from different places. I did not even portray Christ. Why should I portray Muhammad to start with? But there is this Islamophobia going on so strong. Maybe after September 11, it got even stronger, and it's just out there. No matter what you say, no matter, they still can come back to that topic. And I think as building the mosque in New York, the Islamic Center close to where the Twin Towers were is still an issue to follow. I don't know what's going to happen with that. But this is part of a very polarized political environment that is kind of recent. Because I don't recall this, maybe even 10 years ago. Right now it's pretty intense. And it's getting really scary to violent points, like what we have witnessed with politicians being shot like last weekend. But I don't know. It's a serious topic, and the thing is for me is that there is a lot of gray areas. It's not everything black or white, and the more we talk about the need for freedom to express our sincere concerns about society in group, because we cannot do that alone. I feel like it's really hard to be in a lonely struggle, but it's a matter for everybody, all of us as citizens, to really be aware. Where is this coming from? Why we suddenly get exposed to so much violent rhetoric? Hunting rhetoric, like reload, things like that. I basically have more questions than answers too. I really share your concerns. I don't want to take the full answer.
Hi, my statement isn't so much a question as it is a response to the professor to Dorian's left. You initially asked the question, why does images of homosexual sex and religion offend people so much, and why are they so afraid of it? And have an idea, and I just wanted to get your response. There's always been a fusion of heterosexual sex and religion in art. There's been Gravelli's paintings of Saint Sebastian, there's been the statue of Saint Teresa in Ecstasy, so there's always been a fusion of eroticism and spirituality. And I think that a lot of contemporary queer artists like Dominique Johnson in Los Angeles, in London, and Ron Heathy in LA, when they combine these images of homosexual sexuality and religion, it dehumanizes homosexuals. So there's this big push to dehumanize and to make homosexuals, both gays and lesbians, subhuman. And by putting homosexual sex in a religious context, it dehumanizes and makes us more human and more accessible. And people want to prevent that as much as possible.
I don't have anything to say right now. I think Stephen summed it up really well.
Serious time for discussion. I wanted to comment, actually, launching from Dorian's very nice description of how this affects the context in which people live. And your discussion on the history. I have been listening to this argument, that is to say, this cultural argument, for 60 years, which is to say, from the moment I woke up and started listening. It's been going on much longer than that. We can get lost in the specifics of the current situation. It's very important that what the First Amendment does and does not protect. This is, all the specifics are extremely important about how you're going to deal with what's happening now. But that this has been going on for a long time. And one of the things it's really centrally about, apropos of the previous comment, is privilege. Who gets to be human? And one of the things that's going on here is people being offended because they're losing their primacy about defining that. This is an ongoing war. It's been an ongoing war for a very long time. And it has very direct effects, as Dorian is in how people live, how people grow up. And it's not something you get to fight on an individual basis. This is a campaign. There is a campaign to close options down, and there is a campaign to open options up. And I think one of the real questions is, which side are you on?
I wanted to also say that the artists are working within those questions in very interesting ways within this exhibition, and I wanted to flag, because we were talking about artists from Mexico, to flag also A.A. Bronson, who's part of General Idea, who had a photograph of his partner in the exhibition, I think 2 or 3 hours after the partner died. And in the course of this image being withdrawn, Bronson then pressured the Canadian Art Gallery, the National Gallery, into saying, you know, I want my photograph removed from this exhibition. And this then, after a fair bit of provoking, pushed the National Art Gallery in Ottawa to ask the Smithsonian to remove the image from this particular exhibition, SiCa. And keeping in mind that General Idea is very much about this question, this, I think, somehow really captures the work that group did, and 2/3 of that particular group of artists passed of AIDS. But I just wanted to raise, too, that it's so deeply part of the cultural work of the image itself, and that the fact that the Smithsonian has refused to give the image back to Canada, and to this artist in particular, and that the Canadian government, which is quite conservative, absolutely doesn't want to get involved, has actually, in a wonderful way, sort of punched back. And at the same time to say, you know, in these questions of the politics of privacy and the politics of who gets to be represented, that when somebody asks for the return of the image of a beloved, and it ends up in this international context, and I think there's a deep question about the dispossession of one's own history. So I just wanted to sort of bring that forward in terms of the work of General Idea, but also in terms of the legal questions and one's history and the history of HIV and AIDS, to say that here's a case where the image is so caught up in the contracts around the image that the lover cannot have this image back in this context, and has underlined that by saying, please don't stonewall me. So, yeah.
I'd like to address that, and also the previous comment about this being a campaign that is playing out actually probably over hundreds of years and multiple generations, if not thousands of years. It's a highly political, deep issue that very much transcends the incidence of any particular situation. And it's important to take sides. It's one of the reasons why I haven't spoken before about this issue of the integrity of the artwork, because I don't want to muddy the waters, you know. But the integrity of the artwork is also an important issue, and I figured I'd share it with you tonight. But make no mistake, what is behind all of this is homophobia, and that is, you know, and you have to, you know, for better or worse, draw very clear lines when it comes to that. So the issues around this particular exhibition and whether or not work should be withdrawn, you know, the lenders asking for other works to be withdrawn, is actually, I think, very complicated and muddy also. There was a very interesting blog post, I think yesterday, from a lender named Jim Hedges, who had lent a Jack Pearson photograph, and who, inspired by A.A. Bronson, had demanded that the work be returned to him. Unlike A.A. Bronson, who I guess didn't own the work, it was merely a work that he made, so he couldn't actually ask for it. He could ask for it back, but he had no legal right to do so. Jim Hedges owned this object and had asked for it to be removed, and was convinced to change, and said so very publicly. He put a thing publicly that demanding the removal of this object. A week later, now yesterday, he's saying he's changed his mind, that he has been convinced that it is not this show, these curators, or this museum, which is the problem. In fact, they should be lauded for doing this show and for putting these things out there for people to see at all in a place like the Smithsonian. The culprit is elsewhere. He identifies the culprit as the head of the whole Smithsonian institution, which is not the same as the director of the National Portrait Gallery. He thinks the head of the Smithsonian caved to political pressure. So the whole thing is a big, messy soup, but I do encourage you to read this thing. It's on the Huffington Post. Jim Hedges, go on the Huffington Post, search for Hedges, Pearson, something like that, and it's very interesting. And I commend him for changing his mind so publicly about this complicated issue.
I just have one more little thing to add. I couldn't really add more to what you all three of you have so eloquently said. And of course, I completely agree. We have to, be very open about which side we're on. One of the things that I wanted to kind of raise in this context also is this idea that, in this kind of context, as intellectuals, I think, at least, I can only speak for myself, but one of, I think, my tasks is to really investigate and also be public about and, educate, teach, write about the history of all of this. And of course, you've heard me talk about the historical dimension. But one of the reasons for that is, it all comes back to what, I think your name is Stephen, what Stephen said about dehumanizing these stories, because it's all about, you too have been saying, whose story gets told and by whom, and on what level. So what I want to do is really kind of keep it on a very intellectual level, and I also wanted to echo what Larry said. This includes not just the political debate, queer or not, and sort of about human rights in this context, but also, as an intellectual, I'm very interested in actually talking about this art. And one of the things that's been so deplorable is that, to me at least, it seems like we're not really discussing the artwork in much depth as a culture, but we get hung up with these issues, like 11 seconds, is it, of ants crawling over a crucifix, or a few seconds of masturbation. I mean, there's more to be discussed here. There are issues of social critique, that we haven't even gotten into, and this whole idea of the crucifix and the blood, and issues of pain, and it's so much bigger and so much more human than just this one issue, which is very dear to my heart, but just this one issue of queerness. So I really, one of the things I just urge, I guess, us all and myself to do is really to also keep the lens wide and open on all these other issues as well, because that's one of the ways, I think, in which we can actually humanize all this too.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.